Thank you very much, Allie, and welcome everyone to the Consolidations track of the Hyperion Solutions virtual conference. I am Terrance Walker with interRel Consulting Partners, here to present Bye-Bye Customizations. FCC has new functionality. Before I begin, one bit of an ask of you attendees. Can you confirm that you can both hear and see the content of today's session? Once we have positive affirmation, we will move forward. Again, you can do that via the chat or the Q&A. Awesome, thank you all very much. One additional bit of information for anyone who has questions or what have you, please post your questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom application. With that, we'll get started. But first, a bit about interRel Consulting Partners. We are the 5-time EPM Analytics Partner of the Year. We won a number of awards and received quite a few commendations, including we're the 2019 Oracle Partner of the Year. We're also the 2019 Global and North American Partner of the Year, as well as having received the 5-time winner of the BI and Implementation Partner of the Year, and we are a 9-time Time Inc. 5,000 fastest growing companies list. We also have quite a few experts at our firm in that we have 6 Oracle ACEs or ACE directors, as well as having published over 10 of the best-selling books on Hyperion. We are a full-service consulting firm in that we have quite a few practices, including our strategy, consulting, and our training divisions. We also hold key partnerships in that we're an Oracle Cloud Excellence Implementer, as well as being an Oracle Platinum Partner, as well as being a Cloud Select Partner. And as far as our experiences, we are probably the preeminent Oracle EPM consulting firm, given that we have over 150 cloud specializations, and we are that firm, the firm who implemented the first FCC implementation, EPBCS, as well as S-Space Cloud. But enough about interRel. Let's get started with our session. First, I'll begin with speaking to what is this Financial Consolidation and Close cloud thing that you speak of, Terrance? Well, FCC, or the acronym that is for Financial Consolidation and Close, is Oracle's software as a service EPM tool that is purpose-built for consolidations or what have you from a close perspective. The application, again, has quite a great depth of out-of-the-box feature and functionality definitions. It is truly a configurable solution. There's quite a bit of feature functionality definitions that are enabled by feature enablement, as well as being able to extend that specific framework with customizations in the application. We also note that it's very, 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 very easy to maintain, in that with the corresponding content from out of the box perspective, the simple use case of the application is greatly an improvement, better yet, to the prior consolidations application. One thing to also note is that there is a bit of alignment or uniformity across the EPM cloud space, in that FCC actually leverages S-Space as its background engine. Thus, the actual platform is common to other services or business processes, given that financial consolidation is true to that we'd also see within the planning track or business process, as well as far as feature and functionality definitions and the means of managing both metadata and our calculations. As should be expected, the application does again come with quite a bit of pre-built definitions as far as hierarchies and calculations, as well as being able to accommodate the differing forms of consolidations, including minority interest calculations or definitions, and managing the equity pickup. And also from a cost point perspective, there is minimal to no investment required for infrastructure, given that Oracle hosts the entire cloud applications if there's an election to go 100% cloud versus hybrid. From a pure landscaping perspective, the consolidations business process is quite feature rich, given that there are quite a few applications that are part of the consolidation suite, including the consolidations applications, the account reconciliations, including tax management and the supplemental data. But for those electing or opting, which is the case for the most part, to leverage the enterprise suite or the enterprise licensing model, that also includes advanced consolidations within FCC, which is a primary need, I would think, for most implementations. as well as having transaction matching for account reconciliations. And it also includes the tax reporting cloud service for those who would elect to perform some form of tax reporting, including country by country reporting in their applications to produce the tax provision. That said, we'll jump right into what's new. For FCC, we'll start off with metadata. And again, metadata is quite a vexing conversation given the pre-built definitions, or we'll say it in a different fashion. There are different options that we have when we're creating our applications as far as the level of depth of content that our applications will include. That said, as a byproduct of managing the actual metadata, they've actually enhanced our means of validating our metadata in our applications, given that we can now see three differing areas of content as they relate to our metadata validation process, given that we now have specific content true to errors or error messaging, any warnings that might be part of it, or any information that we should be mindful of as we're managing our metadata. One thing to also note is that simply from a little use case perspective, that all errors are not necessarily bad or warnings, given that there could be some situations or scenarios where the actual error messaging or warnings may be good from an optics perspective, but they may not be debilitating as far as your application's usage or use case. We also have some additional data source members that we can actually leverage on applications. And we're speaking to data source. Data source is a dimension that is pre-built in the FCC application, given that in most on-prem Consolidations applications, we found that the actual apps included a data source dimension, which allows us to further segregate where we're sourcing our data from. Well, actually, Oracle extended that from a pure functionality perspective, in that we can now add additional members into our data source dimension, and we then have the ability to define the type of data that we're going to elect to integrate into those particular members. And now from a definitional perspective, we can add members for handling journal entries. We can also create additional members for submitting data into the application. We can also add additional members if you elect or opt to enable the supplemental data feature of FCC. That said, from a data source perspective, the actual attributes associated with those members would include, again, as I mentioned, the definitions of data entry, journal supplemental data. And again, being very mindful that a secondary member property that's applicable for these actual members is a currency type, given that the currency type is more indicative of an application that is multi-currency. And in that actual multi-currency application, we have the ability to define, especially for journals, better yet, the actual currency that we have the ability to submit into our application, given that by default, the journal's input member, it leverages the entity currency member property in our currency dimension, which is by default, the default currency of the entity. We can actually extend that actual definition to input or to submit journal entries in differing currencies than an entity's default currency. That said, we're speaking to the actual application in our differing forms of defining data. The movement dimension and the data source dimension work in concert with the consolidation dimension. The consolidation dimension is no more than an extension of the on-prem value dimension with some additional features that have been enabled in the recent releases of FCC. Given that it is no more than a means of defining our audit trail for how data evolves as a byproduct of the consolidations process. Given that the actual members in the actual dimension, better yet, are indicative of points of review of data as it actually evolves or extends in the consolidations process. That said, from bottom up, we actually have an entity input member, which is the actual submission point or input point for all of our entities. The same holds true for parent entities as well, in that we submit data at the entity input member, and for parent entities and parent entities only. The entity consolidation member is no more than an aggregation point for that particular members or that parent's children as they consolidate or aggregate up to the actual parent. Entity total is no more than an aggregation of that actual content for the entity input and entity consolidation from a reporting perspective. The proportion member is no more than a means of defining the proportionalization of data based on the enablement and or the uses of ownership management in the application. If we're looking to enable the ownership management feature, then we would actually see the actual proportional member be based upon that percentage of ownership that we define in our actual application for said entity or entities. The elimination layer is just that. It is where we actually store, from an intrail perspective, the elimination content as a byproduct of our application consolidation and the enablement of the elimination or intercompany features within the account and the entity dimension. And lastly, the contribution is no more than at the actual level. That speaks to the valuation, post-proportionalization, and post-elimination that will roll from the actual entity to the corresponding entity's parent. Within the consolidation dimension, and yes, I did miss a couple of those members and my talking points in the previous slide, but I missed them intentionally. And that the goal is to speak to additional application features that can be enabled during the initial application creation or subsequently as an application feature enablement. In that we now have the ability to add 3 additional members to our consolidation dimension. Those 3 members include the translated currency input, parent input, and contribution input. That said, as we mentioned, how we can extend our auditability of data in the application and can redefine how we can define data in the app, the translated currency input member actually works in concert with the actual journal entry definition of source data type that we spoke to in the data source dimension. In that, for the translated currency input member, we can now create journal entries, as I mentioned, for the entity in a differing currency than that entity's default currency. And again, be very mindful that the translated currency input member is defined for journal entries and not data submissions. We also have a couple of additional members for submitting data, both pre-proportionalization and post-proportionalization, in that the parent input member is just that. It is an input member that probably is more commonly used for submitting data into the application for an entity that might exist within an author hierarchy. And that, again, we can submit that data in the different currencies from a submission perspective. And again, this is pre-proportionalization, or we can submit a post-proportionalization and post-elimination value at a contribution input member as a byproduct of consolidating those valuations from that particular entity up to its parents. So really excited about that new era of feature functionality that we have in our consolidation dimension for submitting different journals and different currencies, as well as sending different valuation sets or data valuation sets into our application. We also have the ability to amend some of our preceded member properties within our account dimension. More specifically, we have the ability to be able to change, in some cases, the account's consolidation operator or differing metadata properties for those preceded members, which we could not before, which we wish that we could. Well, now we can. One bit of advisement, or maybe a bit of a recommendation, is that as you're going through this process of opting or electing to amend member property definitions, you'll definitely want to run the metadata validation process just to ensure that those member property changes that you're electing to define or amend for those preceded members are valid and won't have a negative impact on the usability of your application. One thing to also note is that if we're going to elect to amend those preceded member properties, then the actual means of managing our master data is a bit different, in that we can't simply export our metadata to a file or a comma delimited file. There's a need to enable the module customization migration feature within our migration module of FCC to ensure that if we're going to elect or expect, better yet, to have these member property updates for our preceded members to be part of our application's updates, we want to make sure that we include that in our export, and we'll have to use that particular file to be able to maintain or manage metadata given that property change, which will not be available if we're simply electing to use simply a comma delimited file to manage metadata. We also now have the ability as a byproduct of the application's enablement. And again, I'm saying feature because that's what they are. It's amazing that we transitioned from a world of mindset of customizations to simply leveraging features of the applications to use or extend the consolidation application. Given that we now have the ability to extend or expand how we manage intercompany data, given that the default definition for intercompany activities is addition, we can now elect to enable the application to subtract or even ignore intercompany activities as a byproduct of the elimination process, as those values roll up to the intercompany entities member and ultimately intercompany top, being especially mindful that if we elect to enable or transition to subtraction or ignore, then we're still leveraging the default eliminations logic and application just under the covers because of the fashion that the answer application has been developed. There's some additional intercompany activities that are posted in the application to account for, to accommodate how data is being written in the elimination process, given the transition from the default additional property to leveraging subtraction or ignoring those intercompany activities. We'll next transition to some additional enhancements in our consolidations and rules areas of FCC. The first being that, again, if you participated in our webcast series, we've always spoken to the ability to extend FCC, given that we have 3 different core areas for submitting insertion rules and applications, those being local currency, translated, and consolidated. And again, within those 3 areas of calculation definitions, we also have 2 insertion points for our rules. And again, those are after the opening balance carry forward for both local currency, translated, and from consolidation perspective. And there's also a container, better yet, for submitting final calculations for local currency trans and consolidated. Again, from a pure use case perspective, if you're reluctant to create custom calculations, this is the location to create them. And theoretically, we can define where those translations should occur from a focused calculation perspective, in that we can define calculations that are to occur at the local currency level or at a translated view, or from a consolidation perspective, we can actually write calculations that'll be post-translations, or we can actually define some form of elimination logic in our consolidated rule set. We also have an equity pickup module that is much more preferable, and from a consultancy perspective, I found that this is much more greatly adopted within FCC than would have been the case on-prem, in that on-prem we wrote these types of logical calculations from a customization perspective. Well, now we actually can leverage the configurable definitions of the equity pickup within FCC, which is a grand win from a development perspective. And more importantly, from an administration perspective, it actually simplifies the actual ownership of the application and carves out a bit of the customizations that might have been prevalent in an on-prem world. And that the equity pickup module is no more than a fashion for handling the levels of investment in an entity in a subsequent holding, in that we can define actually how that data value rolls up and how that data value is treated at the actual holding level. Also, from a reporting perspective, we actually look at this data as opposed to being at a consolidated level. We actually can see it now, or we can focus it now at a legal entity level with the ability to report at a higher level where necessary. One thing to also note is that as a byproduct of the application's feature enablement during application creation, if there is an expectation that we're going to leverage the equity pickup, which highly leverages the levels of ownership or percentages of ownership for corresponding entities, that the ownership management module or feature needs to be enabled in the application's creation. And you'll also want to make it a point to enable the equity pickup feature if you're going to expect to leverage this feature definition in FCC. Also, within the ownership management feature definition, there has been a new enablement for being able to assist in defining where the actual eliminations occur within our ownership management module, in that the partner eliminations feature enables us to define where that particular elimination is actually written. By default, if we're going through and performing some form of elimination, that elimination would occur at that specific entity. Well, with partner eliminations, we now have the ability to transition or to determine where the elimination should be written, given that we can elect or we can opt to have that elimination right to a sibling of that entity if we do not want that elimination definition to occur at that corresponding entity from a reporting perspective. One thing to also note, if the partner elimination feature is enabled, then there is a 7th insertion point rule that is added into our calculations module that is specific for our partner eliminations in that definition from a reporting perspective. Also as a means of addressing or assisting in improving the actual performance of the application, and in some cases helping to define or refine how calculations are written. We now have the ability to enable UDA consolidations, and we can define or create configurable consolidation rules that actually leverage data that is dynamically calculated at either the year-to-date, half-year-to-date, or maybe the quarter-to-date levels of our view dimension for leveraging calculations. And again, by default, given that FCC sits on S-Space, which is a periodic application, in some cases we may have a need that would exceed our desire to calculate data based on year-to-date valuations. Well, now we have the ability to be able to leverage for applications that use extended dimensionality. We have the ability to create rule sets to leverage data that is dynamically calculated, and even on a year-to-date, quarter-to-date, half-year-to-date basis in our calculations. Now, as we know, we have a couple of options how we can actually make this live. We can actually leverage rule set 1, where we simply read the year-to-date value for the current period and write a periodic evaluation when necessary, or we can leverage the prior period's year-to-date valuation to determine what our periodic activity would be in the application. And again, there's some corresponding underlying impacts of leveraging either of those rule sets. But again, be very mindful that if we do want to leverage this area of feature functionality, then again, we want to make certain that we do it on periods that are not the first period of the year or post the first period of the fiscal year. For those of you who've actually gone out and written custom calculations to be able to copy data, or even leverage the copy data feature in the application to move data across scenarios, well, now there's an open balance carry forward feature that allows us to carry forward or move data across scenarios. Given that the application's moving dimension has powerful functionality to define valuations for data, we can now leverage the open balance carry forward feature to copy data to move data across scenarios for the first period data of that scenario to establish an open balance. So from that point, we have the wherewithal to define by data integration what the closing balance is, but we do have to get the ability again to see the open balance valuations and applications. And again, great feature for us. That is a new enablement that in a number of cases in my application development, I found that if this was necessary, we had to write an insertion rule, custom calculation to get this accomplished. Well, as a means of addressing the needs to simplify and to make it a much more universally adoptable application, these types of feature enablements have been made available to us by Oracle, again, as a means of simplifying ownership of these applications. We also have another area of great excitement for me, in that prior to probably a release or two ago, we had to create custom calculations to define how data lived in the moving dimensions for us, assisting us in cash flows reporting. Given that we had a couple of options, we could elect to leverage our integration solution to map data to the corresponding cash flows line item in the moving dimension, or we could assign some form of member property, and we could leverage that member properties in concert with the calculation to write that data to the appropriate moving dimension member. Well, thanks to Oracle, those levels of customization or mapping definitions have been removed, in that we can now leverage a member property in the account dimension that will assist us in defining the default movement member that those corresponding accounts should be associated with. Which simply means that we can leverage out-of-the-box functionality to define or automate, better yet, our statement of cash flows reporting by, one, enabling a calculation feature, and then secondarily enabling a feature in the account dimension to leverage the corresponding moving dimension member names to associate those member IDs with an account to automate statement of cash flows reporting within the moving dimension. A couple of points to make note of as well, in that the account dimension, we can also have global movement identifiers, in that we can associate all of these members or parent members, give an association for their descendants to automatically adopt the corresponding default movement definition, which again is a great win for us, given that we can minimize or carve out some customizations where they may not be necessary. We also have a situation in the last few months, I believe, where they've extended our ability to be able to handle data, some of our data movements, in that we've always had the ability to copy data in application, but that copy of data was more restricted, and that they've now extended that to include some additional dimensions that we can opt to include in our copy data. In that before, we simply had scenario year, period, entity, and data source as our options, which simply meant that every data element within that scenario year, almost approval unit definition, were part of our elections to copy. Well, now we can actually opt to only copy certain data elements within the account, the movement, the intercompany, and the custom dimensions to copy data across different approval unit hierarchies or definitions. And again, if we elect to enable the multi-gap dimension, that would be one of our custom dims. We can actually elect to select certain members from those dimensions in our copy as well. And again, there's no difference, so there's been no pivot or change to those fixed members for both the view, the currency, and the consolidation dimensions as well. So a great win for us as far as being able to further extend or filter the data elements that we want to copy in applications. The same holds true from a journals perspective, in that we can copy journals across periods if necessary. This also is true for both multi-entity journals and for single entity journals, in that I can copy a multi-entity journal to a single entity if I wanted to. Maybe not conventional, but I could. We also have the ability to be able to select the actual accounts that we want to leverage or define in that journal copy. Again, that journal copy, again, from a pure POV perspective, a point of view perspective, is going to be true to where we actually want to copy data to versus the actual source journal entry. So again, be especially mindful when we elect into copy journals what our corresponding destination point of view members are as far as we're going to post to that target destination. In that, a couple of points to be very mindful of. For those journals that would have been balanced from a sourcing perspective, as a byproduct of the copying feature, those journals will be posted. And conversely, for journals that would not have been balanced or there's some form of error, the copy feature still will work. Those journals just simply have a working status and the destination for that copy of the journal. We also have the wherewithal to clear data. And again, from a clear perspective, very similar premise to that I spoke of earlier from a copy perspective, given that we had far less areas for filtering the areas of data that we could copy to. The same thing held true from a clear perspective, in that we can now greater focus our clear activities to include the account, the movement, the intercompany, and our custom DIMs, including the multi-gap dimension as well, with a pure definition for the fixed members for the view, currency, and consolidation dimensions as well. So again, great opportunity for us to be able to assist us if there's a need to clear data. We want to be very, very mindful of what we're clearing, and to be very, very cognizant of the impacts of clearing data in our application as well before we elect to clear data in our applications. As is the case with just common data, we can also clear journals. And again, the clearing of journals is probably a misnomer for some. It's like, why would I ever want to clear a journal? Well, you may want to unpost a journal, or there may be a component of a journal that you may want to undo. Well, with the clear data for journals, we can do just that. And that if I had, for an example, we may have a multi-entity journal where I wanted to clear the data or clear the effects or the impacts of the data in the journal for a single entity. I could elect to select that particular entity and a journal to impact only that entity with no effects or impacts to other entities in that multi-entity journal. Again, this does no more than to reverse the effects of the actual journal activities for the journal, for the entity that we're referencing, with no ultimate impact to the other entities. But from a pure clear perspective, the only actual entity that is truly impacted would be the actual entity that would have been cleared or had the reversal or the reverse impact of the content in the source journal. Also, as we're copying or defining our copy and clear definitions, we have the wherewithal to save those definitions or those POV definitions to a profile, given that there may be a need or desire to leverage or to reuse that definition subsequently. To that effect, we have the ability again to save those as profiles to reference when necessary going forward. So again, this is just again a great feature enablement from Oracle to us, and that as opposed to each time we would want to opt to copy or clear, we would have to go through the exhaustive effort of defining the corresponding point of view content. We can simply leverage the feature definitions again by simply saving that profile for future use. And again, from a pure deployment perspective, we have the ability to leverage both EPM Automate and REST API to be able to deploy those saved profiles when necessary. We also have an additional calculation that's been made available to us in that we use this prior to FCC to impact a different scenario or different year where necessary. If data were to change, again, this is no more than the impact status calculation that is now available to us in either insertion rules or as an on-demand rule. Again, we have 4 specific dimensions that we can define in the actual rule definition with support for functions to be able to make the rules more dynamic as far as the impact status calculations. And again, from a validation perspective, there's certain assurances that we have that we don't impact prior periods other than those that are referred to in our rule definition. And again, we only impact those corresponding entity or entity definitions that are impacted by that particular calculation. And there is also an assurance of no impact if an entity is locked from an impact status perspective. We'll next transition to some performance improvements that have been made available to us. Given that, as I mentioned earlier, this application has really improved over the years, and we've seen simple application performance been a great enhancement from our perspective as far as original release to today, given that we've seen in some cases 75 to 80% performance improvement by simple monthly updates or new feature enablements in these applications. Another great win for us was the transition from being a BSO deployed application to being hybrid to leverage both BSO and ASO for feature functionality definitions, as well as those, again, having a direct impact on improvements from a consolidation perspective. In the upcoming release, there's going to be a definite win for us from a database refresh perspective, in that we'll be better able to focus that database refresh based on changes in the application versus an all-in model. And the application is constantly evolving with additional performance variables that we can enable to assist us in addressing or improving, better yet, performance in our applications. Now, when we speak to the database refresh that I spoke to a moment ago, as I mentioned, the current, which will soon be the old, database refresh process is an all-in model, given that any particular area of content, whether it would have been impacted or not, is part of the actual database refresh. So in some cases, there's an unfortunate need to recompute ownership or to have to reconsolidate or what have you as a byproduct of the database refresh. Well, thank you, Oracle. In an upcoming release, we were finding that the database refresh option is going to be improved from a spirit of it being truly focused on metadata deltas. Given that it is much more focused on changes in the application versus an all-in approach, given that it'll perform a metadata delta check before the database refresh process is actually invoked, and that the actual if there's a change in an entity dimension as far as adding new entities, removing entities, and maybe changing a member within the hierarchy, that might have an impact on the necessity to review the impacts as a byproduct of the database refresh, as well as the corresponding rate changes that might occur. For example, there may be a need, probably the anomaly, but there may be a need to change the default currency for an entity. That again would be an area that would focus or that might trigger the metadata delta for this new database refresh feature that we'll have going forward, as well as any changes or updates to our rates that might exist if we elect to enable a supplemental data module. Again, as a byproduct of the metadata delta tracking, again, that is a variable enablement in the application. And again, as you're noting, we actually can see the actual components as you're going through the actual login definitions. That speaks to the actual requirements or the definitions that have an impact on the need or the lack thereof to perform certain actions in the application, be it for consolidations or the necessity to rerun the ownership computation because of a change or a lack of a change in the actual entity hierarchy. We'll next speak to some general enhancements as we attempt to wrap up. Again, we have seen how the journals module has continued to improve over the last few months, years might be more appropriate, given that we have some additional abilities to be able to define auto-reversing journals with attachments. We also have some additional workflow features for communication, as well as being able to extend the application with year-to-date journal entries that are not just periodic, in that we can leverage both year-to-date journal entries for reversing in the same year, or journal-to-date journal entries that would allow us to reverse in the subsequent year if there would be a journal posted on a year-to-date basis in the last period of the fiscal year. So again, great feature definition updates that assist us in further extending the use case of the FCC for consolidated reporting. We mentioned earlier again, as far as our ability to be able to leverage the journals module in concert with our data source dimension. Again, by default, the standard member that exists for journal definitions would be the FCC journal input member. But again, by simply adding additional data source members that would allow us to create journal entries in differing currencies, leveraging the translated currency input member, our consolidation dimension, we can further extend the actual use case of the application to create or to generate journal entries or adjusting entries in differing input currencies based on our new data source member definition. So again, great win for us from a use case perspective and as a means of further extending the FCC application's usage. From a process management perspective, this was a hallelujah moment for me, given that prior to this feature enablement, if there was a need to add additional entities into our hierarchies, if we're electing to close or leverage the approvals feature within the application, new entity additions required going back to the first year and period of the application to go through the unlocking and relocking process for the new entities that would have been added. Well, thank you again, Oracle. That's changed, given that they have actually extended it to allow for inheritance for new member adds, where these entities would actually inherit the lock status or the approval status of the parent as a means of simplifying the ownership of these FCC applications. So again, great win for us. Again, a couple bit of areas to note that if the entity is added on a shared basis, on a move basis, this actually speaks to the corresponding impacts or the needs to go back and unlock and reconsolidate, given that there's a need to add a member to a shared hierarchy as a shared member. If the effects or the impact of that entity's content is expected to be included in the parent, it's going to probably be a need to unlock the parent and then reconsolidate. The exact same to hold true if we're going to move an entity to a differing parent. If there's an expectation, which there probably is or would be, to see the actual valuations roll from child to parent, there might be a need to reconsolidate. Unless the ownership percentage for that entity would be set to 0, then there probably wouldn't be any effects in that corresponding period. Again, in any period that we expect to see data, presuming that the ownership percentage is greater than 0, we would probably want to reconsolidate when necessary. And in summary, and I'm amazed I finished on time. Hooray, hooray. In summary, this is probably the most amazing or exciting slide for me that I've taken from Oracle, in that the actual consolidations business process has been quite the journey, and that there have been quite a few updates. There have been quite a few feature enablements in the applications that this actual graphic speaks to in great depth or detail. Given that the actual feature enablements or the focus from Oracle has been on constant improvement of applications, while we actually can note that we actually achieved parity with HFM back in late 2018, that wasn't the stopping point. It was actually more or less a launching point for us, in that once we achieved parity with HFM, that actually addressed those misnomers in the market that spoke to what FCC couldn't do, and we then extended the application to extend how the application can be used. And we actually are really excited about how Oracle is constantly soliciting assistance from the user community using the Customer Connect area to extend the application to address certain application feature deficiencies to make the application much more usable. Also, in wrapping up, we want to make certain that for those of you who are in constant need of education, interRel has a simple motto that we're simply here to make the world simply a smarter place. And in doing so, we actually have weekly educational webcasts We have a number of books, as I mentioned earlier, in our Look Smarter Than You Are series. We actually host a number of virtual conferences, as is Hyperion Solutions 2020. And again, thank you guys for attending. We also have quite a bit of content online in our Play It Forward video series on YouTube. And then lastly, for those who have a desire to keep up with the financial news, you're more than welcome to leverage the interRel Financial News webpage for updates on the Financial Times. Again, thank you guys for attending today's session, the opening of the Consolidations track for Hyperion Solutions 2020 virtual conference. Here is a view of our day one Consolidations track content, some great sessions that we have lined up over the next 4 days. Real excited to have you guys on today, and we want to make certain that you guys participate as often as possible in these sessions. Again, Terrance Walker, interRel Consulting. I want to thank you guys, but before I go, as I mentioned earlier, I did want you guys to submit questions in the application, in the session to make it fairly interactive, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can now. For those that I don't have an opportunity to answer, I'll respond to you virtually or via email. Let's see, I think our track lead, Allie's going to probably help me with tracking the questions if I don't get to them all now. I'll do my best. Our kind of group frequently ask if we could have a beginning year balance period added or the 13th period for post adjustments. Also, the answer to your question, Susan, is yes. In the application creation, you can enable the 13th period. A couple of things to note there. Depending on your year with the fiscal calendar, the actual application then leverages a P1 to P13 if that matters. You can still leverage aliases for those members that have your Jan through December, whatever your fiscal definitions are. But we do have the ability to impact a 13th period when necessary as a means of assisting in reporting. Just be mindful of that. The 13th period is not a true adjustment period. It's an actual true period in the application. So again, if your ERPs are enabled for a 13th period and you actually have full GL data for that period from a trial balance perspective, you can leverage the 13th period with an FCC. And if you only have the 13th period as an adjusting period in the application, we could then leverage some of the feature functionality definitions in FCC. For example, we can maybe copy our year-to-date period 12 into period 13, and then supplement that with your adjustment content if your ERP only includes adjustment detail in the 13th period versus a full trial balance. So I hope that answers your question, Susan. If not, just ping me and I'll do my best to follow up if necessary. Keys wrote that I read that FCC is about a faulty period application, which is absolutely true. So you did a great job reading. Can that be overridden to make it year-to-date? The short answer is heck no. The best answer is heck yes, given that we can extend the application to allow for differing views of data, which is why the simple enablement or the usage of the view dimension is very, very powerful. And as I mentioned earlier in our session, there are a number of calculations that we can leverage to assist in making the application much more year-to-date centric. But again, by default, the application is periodic with different application enablement or features to assist in extending it to have differing views, whether that be year-to-date, half your data, what have you. So again, hope that actually answers your question, Keys. If not, ping me and I'll do my best to extend or expand upon my response. James asked, does ownership management equity pickup have to be enabled at application creation or can it be enabled anytime? The simple answer to your question, James, is if I'm not mistaken, this is an application or feature enablement. If necessary, you can turn the ownership management on after the application has been created. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you can turn it off too. I have to go back to check, but I know that I can enable it post-creation. And if I'm not mistaken, I did think I read somewhere that if I wanted to turn it off, I could. So maybe on that one, James, I'll confirm the off, but I do know that the on, as far as the feature enablement, can be done post-application creation. And James is looking for confirmation now. Just to confirm with regards to clear data and saved profiles, did I say, that would be me, you could have EPM automate command to invoke those saved profiles. The simple answer to your question, James, is yes. If we're going to elect to save our clear copy definitions to a profile, we can invoke those actual saved profile definitions via an EPM automate command, or we can leverage the REST API to invoke those profiles as well. from a clearing copy perspective. Let's see, we are at the appointed hour. So at this point, I think we should probably stop now. But Bernardo, rest assured, so I will make it a point to respond to your question or your query, or for anyone else who may have had a comment or what have you, I will make it a point to respond to you as quickly as I can. But I do want to make certain I say thank you all once again for attending the opening session in our Consolidations track. Really excited for you guys to be here, and we cannot wait to see you guys again. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you guys later.